Welcome. This is my first vlog in some years, and the reason for my silence are a couple. The main one being that I've been writing a biography of my father. I work, so I don't have much spare time, and in 2027 I will be retiring, and I may have some more time then. I'd like to do something related to David Bentley Hart, maybe a few actually. But currently I'm a bit obsessed with early science fiction, and I'd like to do some meditations on that. But for now, this one, I want to focus on the Golden Age great science fiction writer A E van Vogt. Lately, I've been re exploring his work and have started to build into an obsession with the man. Looking across YouTube science fiction reviewers, I have found some interesting takes, but I feel like he is underappreciated, both for what he achieved and for what the nature of his work actually is. This is also the case in reading some critical works on science fiction. Barry Malzberg wrote the following: Alfred Elton van Vogt may be the most difficult of all science fiction writers to judge. So much of Van Vogt's work, reread after many years, seems to work in terms that are sub or transliterary. So much of his power seems to come not from sophisticated technique and or pyrotechnic style, as from his ability to tap archetypal power, archetypal them, and open up veins of awe or bedazzlement that otherwise are found in love or dreams. This is not to call Van Vogt incompetent. He is anything but. Indeed, he was from the beginning a competent commercial writer with a natural gift for the medium of science fiction and an extremely conscious awareness, rare enough in popular fiction, about the effects he sought and the methods he used. But no display of mere competence, no explanation of awareness or measure of talent can account for the fact that Van Vogt's early work, from 1939 to 45, say, had upon his audience and has to this day. What Van Vogt had then was nothing less than the ability to deliver A. total alienness within B. a hugely panoramic background that C. seemingly lacked reason and yet came together to D. end by making total of terrifying sense. He goes on. Van Vogt might have been the first of post-war American novelists, it seems. His vision foreshadowed modern absurdity. And he writes, it created what Brian Aldiss has called fine, careless rapture of early Van Vogt, an artist of the commercial medium who went away into other things for almost a decade and a half, and who returned in the mid-60s with a different kind of work, a work that by no literary standard can be called inferior, but one that, and I am sure Van Vogt would be the first to admit this, lacked the early sense of mystery, impact, influence. That impact has yet to receive satisfactory assessment. Science fiction, although maturing as a literature, at least the cliché is that it is maturing. Sometimes I am not so sure of this. Still has little critical literature. What critical literature there is, Budrus, Blish, Knight, Russ, Pynchon, has usually ignored or underassessed Van Vogt, preferring to place him routinely within the Golden Age format and then dismiss the unique and individual impact of his work, which strikes me as having gone far beyond that of any of his contemporaries in its uniqueness. Heinlein, Asimov, Del Rey, Kuttner are marvellous writers making their contribution as a group to a body of literature. Van Vogt is standing off by himself, building something very personal and unique. His work is neither inferior to nor above that of his contemporaries. It simply cannot be judged in the same way. Above all, Van Vogt is to himself. I salute this man. He is irreplaceable. He is incontestably alive. So says Barry Malzberg. I think we're still in this place. In fact, if anything, I think we appreciate and understand him less now. It seems to be regarded as a truism that the three biggies of the Golden Age science fiction authors are Robert Heinlein, Arthur C. Clarke, and Isaac Asimov. And I've seen people talking about the Golden Age authors and failing to even mention Van Vogt. To me, this is a failure to even understand the Golden Age. Outlaw Bookseller did a video on the Gallant's Golden Age collection in which he criticised them for producing books with that moniker that are significantly after the Golden Age, even into the 1960s. I think some even prior to the Golden Age. So what is the Golden Age period? Well, I did loosely think of it as the time John W. Campbell started editing Astounding through the 1950s. Well, that is the period that probably fascinates me the most. I can see now why the 1950s are thought of as a significantly different period to the Golden Age. The Golden Age of science fiction was not an age of science fiction novels. It was an age of pulp magazines, and principally Campbell's Astounding. They had colour covers, cheap paper, black and white illustrations, advertising, and occasional short science articles. I think it would be good for there to be some classic releases of key issues so we can appreciate them in their original formats. By 1950, the standalone science fiction novel was a major part of the scene, and there was a greater diversity of magazines, so John Campbell was no longer the primary driver. When I came to science fiction in the 1970s, the books I associated with science fiction were paperback novels with cool airbrush cover art, and they were about 160 to 220 pages long. They would grow longer as the years went by. I did not realize that Slam or the Weapon Makers did not first appear in that format, or that Rogue Ship was originally a bunch of short stories that Van Vogt reworked into a novel. A bit of Van Vogt's life. He was born in rural Canada in 1912. Due to the Depression, his family was poor and he never made it to college. An essential part of his nature is that he is self-taught. He reminds me a lot of ways of Colin Wilson, with whom he later corresponded with and met. I've read Van Vogt's short autobiography, from which a lot of this information I'm taking comes from. It was started as an oral history which he massaged into a narrative. I'd recommend anyone who has become obsessed with Van Vogt to read it. It is available on the Internet Archive. Unfortunately, physical copies are scarce. Van Vogt talks about becoming increasingly introspective as he grew up. The family moved from rural Canada to the big city of Winnipeg. This caused him to make the distressing change from being good at school to near the bottom of his class. He credited this in pushing him inwards, and from this time he started to read a couple of books a day. From the age of 14, Van Vogt considered himself a writer. He had a major discovery while doing a writing exercise. He suddenly discovered how to write a line of fiction. He wrote a description of the ocean, which he'd never seen, but the line impressed him for its verisimilitude, which he regarded as the essence of fiction. Also at this time, he picked up on the newsstand the 1926 issue of Amazing Stories, the first dedicated science fiction pulp magazine. He took it home and he read every issue published while he was living in Winnipeg. In the coming years, he was impressed by the writing of A. Merritt, his vivid imagination, Max Brand, Fred McIsaac, Don A. Stewart, the pseudonym for John W. Campbell, E. E. Smith, E. Phillips Oppenheimer, John Dixon Carr, Edgar Wallace, Frank L. Packard, the Grey Seal stories, Raphael Sabatini, and H. L. Mencken. He was very interested in detective stories, but he avoided any books with long paragraphs. He read westerns, B. M. Bauer, Zane Grey, Max Brand, numerous mystery, suspense, and adventure. Bulldog Drummond. He was a fan of P. G. Wodehouse. He would also go on to read Balzac, Dickens, Jane Austen, Arnold Bennett, George Moore, and other 19th century novelists of England and Europe. He read the plays of Shaw, Ibsen, Moliere, some of the Greek ancients. Among the more recent writers he enjoyed was Aldous Huxley with Chrome Yellow and Point Counterpoint. He was a voracious reader of many popularizations of science and psychology of that time. In history, he was fascinated by the Napoleonic era, Rome in the age of Julius and Augustus Caesar, Italian Renaissance, King Richard the Lionheart of Britain and Europe, and ancient Egypt. He didn't consider this research. He just got obsessed with various subjects and would familiarize him with countless details. Van Vogt discovered a book, The Only Two Ways to Write a Short Story by John W. Galashaw. He read it all through and he found it incredibly hard to read, as it was long, gave plenty of examples of stories, which were numbered and analysed line by line. The idea was that stories should be written in scenes of about 800 words, and each scene had 5 steps. First, let the reader know where this is taking place. Second, you establish the purpose of the main character or the purpose of that scene. Third, you have interaction of them trying to accomplish that purpose. The fourth step is make it clear, did they or did they not accomplish that purpose. Then the fifth step is that in all the earlier scenes, no matter whether he achieves the purpose or not, things are going to get worse. He was also influenced by Thomas Uzel's book Narrative Technique. Van Vogt must be one of the very few authors to have built their career on a popular how-to guide, which points to the irony that he's perhaps individualistic in being unique in following a guide. In Ottawa, Van Vogt took a course from the Palmer Institute of Authorship entitled English and Self-Expression, which he thought really helped him as a writer. Whoever created it was a lover of words, and Van Vogt would sometimes use words simply for their sound, or he'd have a kind of instinctive response to them. Wanting to test out these techniques, his eye was caught by a writing prize for true life story. He spent 9 days visiting the library to complete his story. It was written from the viewpoint of a young woman during the Depression period, and he called it I Lived in the Streets. They changed the title to No One to Blame But Herself, and while it didn't win the prize, he sold it for $110, which was still a significant amount of money. He was soon writing and selling more stories to confession magazines, and eventually did win a $1,000 first prize, which sent him spinning into a state of euphoria. These stories also used his fictional sentences, where every sentence would have an emotion in it. However, he became tired of this genre. He realized he couldn't write something that he wouldn't read, and midway through writing a story, he gave it up in disgust and never wrote another. He then wrote some radio plays beginning in 1934 for a local Canadian station. Wasn't well paid. And then, a couple of years later in 1938, he saw a science fiction magazine on a newsstand. It was not Amazing Stories, which he regarded as the science fiction magazine. It was the August issue of Astounding. And he started reading a story by Don A. Stewart called Who Goes There? Having got caught up in the story, he bought the magazine and finished reading the story when he got home. This proved to be a turning point. He then wrote to the editor with an outline of a story, not knowing that he was the author of the story that had inspired him. If Campbell hadn't responded, that might have been that. But he encouraged him to write. He sent in his first story, Vault of the Beast, which was rejected, but with encouragement for more and some suggestions. He then wrote Black Destroyer, which was not only accepted, but was used as the cover story. This was a breakthrough all round. Van Vogt had found his perfect niche, and the story elicited an excitement in the readers, and it is this issue, and particularly this story, which is often cited as the start of the golden age of science fiction. He would soon write Discord in Scarlet, and together with Black Destroyer and a couple of other stories, would later form part of the fix-up novel Voyage of the Space Beagle. He soon realized he would need to write something different from monster stories. So he wasn't known as a one-trick pony, and started on his first serialization, the novel Slan. Reading these works now, one can still appreciate how exciting their appearance must have been. He surprised himself, tapping unplumbed depths of creativity. He felt completely at home in the medium. The stars seemed to align, the right person at the right place. He'd grown up with fledgling science fiction magazines, and he'd turn up when there was a right editor. When Van Vogt wrote his true life stories, his fictional sentences had each contained emotion. For his science fiction, he developed science fiction sentences, where he tried to write each sentence so that the reader would have to make a creative contribution. Each sentence had what he called hang-ups, with something missing, making it hard to read his work fast or skim read it. Van Vogt married E. Hull in 1939. She went on to write science fiction too, and they remained together until her death in 1975. Shortly after writing Slan, John W. Campbell contracted Van Vogt to write for Astounding. It's worth noting that he did not do this for Asimov, and that during the Golden Age, Van Vogt was regarded as a more significant and exciting writer. He supplied a good portion of the material published in Astounding Science Fiction. His stories all had a quality of mood, they had drive and imagination, which surprised him, as he regarded himself as a relatively practical person. He lived a very ascetic existence, because in order to produce what was needed, he worked from the time he got up until about 11 o'clock at night, every day, 7 days a week, for years. Van Vogt never worked his stories out in advance. He discovered where he was going as he wrote, and writing in 800-word blocks, with the tight structure from his writing system, he would often get stuck until he realized that after sleeping on a story problem, a resolution often came upon waking or from his dreams. He then worked out a system for harnessing this approach, where he would formulate the problem he had, set his alarm for 90 minutes, and jot down ideas that came to him, and repeat that process throughout the night. He regarded it as a way of penetrating the subconscious. Again, he did this for years. Van Vogt noted, "I decided long ago that out of dreams must come another kind of enduring reality, and that readers would respond to such in a very involved way, without knowing what deep unconscious motivation stirred them." Working like this all day, 7 days a week for years, likely took its toll. C.M. Cornbluth died young from a heart attack under the stress of needing to write enough to make a regular income. This became something of a recognized problem of Golden Age writers. Van Vogt's work took a hit from Damon Knight's 1945 article, Cosmic Jerry Builder, A E van Vogt, which was reprinted in his collection of essays In Search of Wonder, first published in 1956, in which he described the world of Nale as one of the worst allegedly adult science fiction stories ever published, and Van Vogt himself as a pygmy who has learned to operate an overgrown typewriter. Unfortunately for Van Vogt, Damon Knight would later become the founder of Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers of America and co-founder of the National Fantasy Fan Federation, So he was an incredibly influential person within the scientific community, and his criticism significantly damaged A E van Vogt's reputation. In 1949, Van Vogt wrote the Hypnotism Handbook with Charles Edward Cook. Obviously quite unlike anything he'd written before, but it did surface an interest in the mind that had been apparent in his fiction. I suspect that Van Vogt needed a break from writing, and he was worried about getting caught up in automaticness and failing to grow. He observed how writers became passé. They became old-fashioned to the readers. Another generation comes up in approximately a 10-year cycle. So his first 10 years in science fiction was over. A new reality is coming up. What should he do? Then L. Ron Hubbard wrote a massively popular book, Dianetics, The Modern Science of Mental Health. And he decided to try and recruit Van Vogt for his new adventure into the life of mind, which had developed with John W. Campbell. Hubbard started calling Van Vogt long distance, which at that time was incredibly expensive, and his persistent calling, day after day, eventually overcame Van Vogt's initial resistance. It was beyond Van Vogt's conception that anybody would phone that often and talk that long at those rates. So he became involved in Dianetics. One of the reasons the book Dianetics impressed him was its lack of mysticism, not knowing at that time that this was mainly due to John W. Campbell's editing. Van Vogt had previously met Hubbard in 1945 at a social gathering, and his mysticism was apparent. So the lack of it in the book made him think it must be a good system, because it had knocked that out of him. He started analysing himself, seeing his family strained through trauma. He noticed there were very few mothers in his stories. They're missing. Where was she in his story? Was she there as little as it appeared, or maybe she was there a lot? He concluded the latter. He was personally impressed by the results of his auditing, and Van Vogt was quickly appointed head of the California Dianetics operation. Hubbard was a morning person and Van Vogt a night person, so their times at the centre diverged. His wife had been ill and had had operations about every 2 years, starting from about 1940. In 1951, a doctor examined her and suspected cancer. According to Van Vogt, with Dianetic auditing, her health issues faded. She was not sick again for about 20 years when the problems returned. The California Dianetics organization spent $500,000 in 9 months and went broke. California was the only branch that did not go into bankruptcy, which Van Vogt had an aversion to. So with an attorney friend, they fronted up to see all the creditors, and they let them fold and pay what they could. Hubbard would go on to develop Scientology, which was of no interest to Van Vogt because of its mystical religious aspects. I think the money from Dianetics and Scientology and the adulation Hubbard received through his fantastical claims, for which he started to have a reverent audience, ready with adulation rather than cynicism, did not do well for Hubbard's own mental health. Campbell too seems to have had no long-term benefit from his Dianetic work. They were certainly two people who needed mental health breakthroughs, and Hubbard especially would cause a lot of personal damage. I think Van Vogt remained pretty oblivious to Hubbard's subsequent exploits, but with his wife Mayne, they decided to open up their own Dianetic Center in Los Angeles, which was partly supported by creating his fix-up novels from earlier short stories throughout the 1950s. He saw Dianetics as similar to Freudian therapy. Whereas Freud allowed the patient to freely associate, Dianetics would concentrate on a single incident, going through it again and again. When that was done, things seemed to fade away. So after another period of 10 years, in around 1961, he set aside Dianetics, although his wife would continue and he would occasionally be drawn back for old clients. and he didn't stop thinking about psychology and developing systems of his own. He returned to writing science fiction when he met Friedrich Pohl in the early 60s. He asked him to write for Galaxy, which Pohl was then editing. He wrote The Expendables and The Silky. He was also working on a book called The Money Personality, thinking about what personality traits did wealthy people have, as for all his intense work, he still had trouble making enough money. In the early 1990s, he was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. His second wife demonstrated her devotion to him by maintaining his business affairs and basically managed his life until he died in 2000. So, what do we make of his work? Damon Knight's critique had a lasting impact. However, Philip K. Dick, a significantly respected writer, would come to defend Van Vogt. He wrote, "I started reading science fiction when I was about 12, and I read all I could. So any author who was writing about that time, I read. But there's no doubt who got me off originally, and that was A E van Vogt. There was in Van Vogt's writing a mysterious quality, and this was especially true in the world of Nalé. All the parts of that book did not add up. All the ingredients did not make a coherency. Now, some people are put off by that. They think that's sloppy and wrong. But the thing that fascinated me so much was that this resembles reality more than anyone else's writing, inside or outside of science fiction." He directly addressed the criticism. Damon feels it's bad artistry when you build those funky universes where people fall through the floor. It's like he's viewing a story the way a building inspector would when he's building your house. But reality really is a mess, and yet it's exciting. The basic thing is, how frightened are you of chaos, and how happy are you with order? Van Vogt influenced me so much because he made me appreciate the mysterious chaotic quality in the universe, which is not to be feared. Van Vogt said the following: "Were it not for having run into science fiction and gained some consciousness expansion, I would have ended up a clerk in the Canadian government." Van Vogt believed that humanity is just individuals who do, have, are, and feel. The same wheels turning over, the same overall thoughts as they have for millennia. In our moment of life, we keep our gaze on the ground and grow through our endless repetitions, and that's okay. I'm glad they're there. With their bright eyes and bright brains, I'm glad they're keeping the place going. But it bothered him that not only did they live these repetitions, they also want to read about them, and endlessly so. So he felt that science fiction was like raising his eyes up to look at the stars and locate himself in space and visualize himself on a small planet at the outer rim of the Milky Way galaxy, 30,000 light years along, one spoke from the galaxy's center. And so science fiction gradually changed his nature, and he's glad of that change. Van Vogt notes that reading science fiction lifted me out of the do and be and have world and gave me glimpses backwards and forwards into the time and space distances of the universe. I may live only 3 seconds, so to speak, but I have had the pleasure and excitement of contemplating the beginning and the end of existence. Short of being immortal physically, I have vicariously experienced just about everything that man can conceive will happen by reading science fiction. He saw reading science fiction as a transformative experience. Is it? I don't know. What I do know is that for me, reading Van Vogt gives that experience more than any other science fiction writer. That we are being transformed, and that maybe in the future we will become something greater than we are.